Thank you, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who is professor in the program of History of Consciousness. And Maria will be introducing Vron. Ware.
Oh, don't clap at me. Hi, everyone. It's a huge pleasure and an honor to introduce you today, Vron Ware. Vron is a London-based writer and photographer who introduces herself currently as a recovering academic, which is a subjective state that I'm sure many of you feel resonating with you or with your future, whether it is now or a close future or in the distance. Vron asked me to be very brief in this introduction to keep time for the discussion, so I'm going to try, but it's a challenge to keep short, because the more I know about Vron, the more I am amazed by her rich, interesting, and very inspiring trajectory. So Vron Ware has a long career in academia and beyond, with internationally recognized books on the politics of gender and race, colonial history, national identity, militarism and peace, the cultural heritage of war, and ecological thought. Her practice is transdisciplinary and ranges from studying material objects and images to doing ethnography and combing historical archives. Like our other very esteemed guests today, Vron has a history with Santa Cruz and gave her first book talk for her influential book, Beyond the Pale, White Women, Racism and History, here at UC Santa Cruz in 1992. Something that I relate well with, because my first, let's say, notable or important for me academic talk was also at UC Santa Cruz. So I feel a kind of biographical connection. Vron has held positions and taught cultural geography, gender studies, sociology at universities in the UK and in the US, and is currently a visiting professor at the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics. Her photographic documentary work has been used in television documentaries in dramas and in the BBC and in work such as the very influential filmmaker Steve McQueen. And then her photography has been also exhibited in quite illustrious, prestigious art institutions, but also more like grassroots and community networks. And I think people at Santa Cruz also like to know about these other sides of the work, is that she has also led a number of non-academic and para-academic projects and campaigning from anti-racism, working with the anti-fascist campaign group Searchlight from the 70s, and editing their magazine from 1981 to 1983. In the 80s, Vron, with two friends of hers, including, I think, an architect, funded the Women's Design Service, who was working with residents, local residents and architects in London to radically alter cities in order to make them suit better to women's needs. A project that also was connected to the Matrix Feminist Design Cooperative, and all these projects were quite influential to the new architecture movement in London. So you can see the transdisciplinarity is not only within academia or art institutions, but also towards public activism. So I invite you all to explore her writings, interventions, and photography. Much of that is accessible online and through her website. And I'm sure that many of the younger generations here will be very impressed by the relevance of her thinking and practice for the predicaments that we are facing with the renewed branch of fascism that we are confronting, white supremacism, nationalism, and the also renewed threats of war, military escalation, and ecological destruction. The work that I've been discovering through engaging with Vron's work is really, it makes me feel like we are having a comeback of so many of the issues that you addressed and that you gave us tools to think, in particular for me, for my positioning as a white anti-racist feminist scholar. And I am really inviting anyone who feels they have questions about those things today to re-engage with her earlier work. But today's talk focuses on her recent book, Return of a Native, Learning from the Land, that was published in 2022, and that was, I understand, years in the making. Maybe in the making since the day you were born somehow, because it's talking about a place where you were actually born. This book weaves a range of the themes that I have mentioned, but she works them together to do what she calls a forensic investigation of rural England, and in particular by planting her feet firmly in the soils of northwest Hampshire. So for those who think, oh, well, this is going to be about northwest Hampshire, and how am I going to relate with that? I think this kind of place-based knowledge and investigation that Ron is making connects enormously to the questions about how to produce place-based knowledge today anywhere. And I know, obviously, Santa Cruz is very engaged in producing different sorts from many ranges of disciplines and practices, place-based knowledge. And how to weave in that place-based knowledge what Val Plumwood, the Australian ecofeminist Val Plumwood calls shadow places, all these places that don't seem to be in the place, but that have constituted the place. And I will keep some of the comments on that kind of work that Ron does and the examples from her book for the discussion. So I did approach this book expecting familiar themes and a form of nature cultural writing that I have encountered in my work on transformations in human-soil relations. But I actually was quite surprised by the kind of scholarship and how the scholarship is put together in a very inspiring way. I was challenged by the amount of layers it uncovers, the provocations at every turn, and ways of reading the land that do not work along linear timelines, where the land is not reducible to just space or just for situating ourselves in space, and soil is not just merely matter, and where the memory of the soil disrupts dominant historical and present narratives on the transformations on relations to land, and also what they mean for the constitution of identity, for identity formation. What are these relations with land still meaning for identity formation, and how do we deal with those without, and I think the title of her book is provocative in that sense, Return of a Native. So what does it mean to return as a native without being nativist? I think that this book offers a lot of cues to do that. So I look forward to hearing more from Vron about the paths that she has taken along these lands today, because I think she's going to talk more about the paths as method. What kind of method has she used to turn her attention to the soil? And I really appreciate that you're here today with us. And please join me in warmly welcoming Vron.
Thank you, Maria. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you all for being here today with us. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and it's been fantastic to meet new people as well as see old friends in the last couple of days. And as Maria said, I did give my first talk. I wasn't even an academic in 1992. And in some way, this is a continuation, as Ian just used a useful phrase, which is picking a quarrel with the place that you're from. And that applies to both books. And yes, this particular project has been probably over 20 years in the making. So I begin with an homage or homage, as you say, to Adrian Rich, the denizen of Santa Cruz, and this wonderful quote from Notes Towards a Politics of Location, which has been a sort of guiding text over many decades. So for some time now, I've been wanting to understand the category of rural as a keyword that contains and conceals a huge amount of history. And clearly it means different things in different countries and can be measured and defined in all sorts of ways. It's a relational term with shifting meanings depending on context. And of course it plays a particularly important role in questions of national identity, both Englishness and Britishness, especially in England. As Peter Linebaugh once said about a discussion of an essay by William Morris, who was lying on the road in the countryside thinking, you think you know what's coming when people start talking about the English countryside, about rural England. So Raymond Williams described the terms country and city as changing historical realities, that defied our real social experiences of many kinds of intermediate and new kinds of social and physical organization. Yet, he said, we need to resist the temptation to reduce historical variation to symbols or archetypes. If we do not see these processes, he said, or see them only incidentally, we fall back on modes of thought which seem able to create the permanence without the history. We may find emotional or intellectual satisfaction in this, but we have then dealt with only half the problem. For in all such major interpretations, it is the coexistence of persistence and change which is really striking and interesting, and which we have to account for without reducing either fact to a form of the other. Or, to put it more theoretically, we have to be able to explain in related terms both the persistence and the historicity of concepts. So in political contexts, the word rural has come to signify oversimplified alignments recently with political allegiances and grievances. So how does it articulate or encompass fractious arguments or over who belongs and who doesn't, who is included and who is left behind, or who feels they don't belong and who is allowed to go where? So of course there are many ways of calibrating the proportion of rural inhabitants of any country by these sort of graphs. And this is from the EU, and of course the UK used to be part of that, and you could tell the proportion of rural areas to towns and suburbs and cities. It's actually quite interesting to see the variation. And England doesn't have nearly as much rural land as you might think it does, given its sort of global significance because of questions of culture and art and literature. Compared to countries like Norway, it has actually very little. And I think recently, for example, the data gathered in France over who votes for the Front National and other far-right groups has been broken down according to where people live. And again, it's a question, there's an assumption that people who live in rural areas are more likely to drift to the far right. And indeed, in this country, when you have a two-party system, there is a definite pattern showing that one of those parties is thought not to be sympathetic to the needs of those who live in rural areas. And I think that that's true here, but then when you look more closely at the data, it's actually quite complicated. The terms urban and rural seem actually entirely inadequate to explain political allegiances, and yet there are patterns and predictable responses, especially in this two-party system. So in the UK, the rural vote, which is very much associated with the Conservative Party, associated with Brexit, and here too, the idea that the Tories have more to offer, the landed gentry have more to offer the rural population, particularly farmers. Now, farmers is a very strange category, because as you know, farmers are not, there are farmers and farmers. There are farmers who are landowners, and there are farmers who rent the land, and there are people who just scratch a living by growing a small amount of food. So the Labour Party in the UK is very much associated with urban issues, and particularly questions around immigration and sort of metropolitan culture. In his book about the toxic politics of English nationalism, called New Model Island, Alex Niven wrote that the great divide in English life is between the cities and everywhere else. But then this means, if you accept that the term rural is not really interrogated. It's as though the rural sections of the country are left behind. They're kind of weighing the country down, in fact. They're not really examined more carefully. So this book, Return of a Native, began as an exploration of rurality, unpicking of what is commonly known as the countryside, centred on a small village in central southern England. So a project I began in 1999. This is where I was born and grew up, hence the use of the term native. And it was where my mother had lived until a few years ago when she died at the age of 97, hence the return part. I should say I was encouraged to embark on this project in the late 90s by an American, the esteemed ethnomusicologist Mark Slobin, who many of you will know, who seemed fascinated by my village, just in that way, my English village. And I was subsequently spurred on by other friends visiting from the US, some of whom, unfortunately, when visiting, pronounced it to be suburban, much to my annoyance, no names mentioned. So this village provided a place to start, even though I was completely alienated from it, had been for many years, somewhere that worked as a foothold for making sense of the world that we share today. So of course it's not a new question, but I was guided by a number of inspiring writers, one of whom is Sven Lindqvist, the great Sven Lindqvist, the author of Exterminate All the Brutes, Terra Nullius, The History of Bombing, and so on, who followed a path of exploration that kept him very near the point of departure. In retrospect, it was particularly the philosophy of his book, Dig Where You Stand, published in 1978, but not published in English until 2023. He drew inspiration from many sources, particularly a public history campaign in China where he lived for 2 years, and also Nietzsche's injunction, Where You Stand, Dig Deep. His book was intended as a guide to help anyone investigating their own job, their place of work, and he chose a concrete factory. So it's really how to research the history of the concrete factory where you work. It's a perfect example of an industry that could be found in many countries. And needless to say, this is before the internet, when research was a very different activity. It's an absolutely fascinating book. You just pick it up and immediately you're into like patents from the 1950s. So it's important to sort of make it clear this is not a local history that I set out to write, which is confined to the particularities of the place. There are plenty of these at the moment, often rooted in narratives of self-discovery or preoccupation with an environmental vision that remains inside a spiritualized and naturalized national frame, as Rob Nixon warns in his fantastic book, Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor. And it's not an autobiography in any sense either, although that doesn't exclude the phenomenological aspects of memory and recollection, nor is it strictly ethnographic, as the snatches of conversation and recollections can sit for some time, and in this case, many years, before they make sense of things in retrospect. However, it all entails a process of self-questioning. So considering it's all so familiar, how come I didn't know, is a feeling I had a lot. An important principle of our old friend feminist curiosity that Cynthia Enloe has urged us to adopt. The need to ask why we don't know about these things, like the colonial past, the workings of military power, and, can I add, our relationship to food and farming, consumption as well as production. So, yes, where it is, South Central England, relatively rural, where there's strict planning rules about who can build what and where. And then I kind of came to think, instead of actually starting from our family house, where my mother still lived at the time, I decided to stand somewhere else outside any particular community, 1.5 miles away. The village snagged me too much in memories as well as social networks to which I had little allegiance and didn't really know anything about anyway by that time. This particular device allowed me to, here we are, I stood here, literally and as well as mentally, at a crossroads. It's allowed me to look around, up as well as down, brought me into contact with land and therefore soil. I could also keep an eye on the horizon and see the view from the brow of the hill. And in fact, this signpost was my first guide, a reminder of the outside world in every direction, provided all sorts of clues as to where I was and where I could go. Also made me wonder who else had passed by this way. Excuse me. In fact, once I started thinking about this place, I made numerous discoveries. So, for example, the American abolitionist Moses Roper, who's lecturing in church halls in villages on either side, would probably have passed through this way. William Cobbett, the famous journalist and agitator who stayed in one of the villages just to the east and wrote about his conversations as he rode around collecting information about farming and rural politics in 1820. He was a notorious racist, ferocious in his support for the English working man, particularly those who were working on the land. There was just one house visible, you can't quite see it, just to the left, a white house, which I remember was occupied by an American Air Force family in the 1950s, as was our neighbour in the village. The fields on one side were always referred to as a heath, which intrigued me because actually this is an agricultural area. It's not a particularly wild area. Heathland is a distinctive ecology that is actually one of the characteristics is a very poor soil. It's been a very overworked soil. The thing that made me most curious was that one of the fields, or this sort of whole area, particularly on the right-hand side, had been common land belonging to a village over the hill and was now a field under cultivation. But it had been ploughed in 1942, actually by Italian prisoners of war, to allow people to grow food there, for a farmer to rent it to grow food. The land was promised to the villagers, of course never returned. And I'd learned about this from someone in the village who had been campaigning about it for a number of years until they lost, but he had a memory of it before, during, and after. I had access to a number of old maps showing the extent of common land, but then I discovered something else that I didn't know. This was a mile and a half from where I'd grown up. In 1818, 800 acres were enclosed by the Dewar family, part of the Whisky dynasty from Scotland, who'd bought a local manor in the 1770s. They'd made their wealth from a sugar plantation in St. Kitts. Following the abolition of slavery in 1833, they were awarded the sum of £2,118, today approximately £143,000 compensation. The reason I didn't know about this family before was that they lived in a different parish, and it turned out that the parish line ran straight up this road. I didn't know about them because the legend of their occupation of this other parish, which of course is a mode of governance which was exported by the British to their colonies, had not been a factor in our side, on our parish. The name was not a sort of familiar name from the histories and other sort of social historical records. Now, of course, the parish boundary was very important. I'd never really thought much about it, but in addition to being the kind of mechanism for recording births and deaths and marriages, which had been for a number, hundreds of years, since the 16th century, it was also a mechanism for allocating poor relief and also instituting borders between places. So those who moved parishes gave up their eligibility for poor law relief until they'd lived for at least a year somewhere else. I was also curious about this spot because I had this memory that one of the villages on the signpost had been bought by somebody, had bought a village. In 2009, the heir to the H&M fast fashion company, founded in Sweden, had bought this village of Lincolnholt, which is on the sign, for £25 million. And finding out how this might have been possible led me to understand the commodification of English farmland after the Tories decided to waive inheritance tax in the mid-90s. This, of course, had a dramatic effect on land values. If you buy a piece of land and you do some aspect of farming, your inheritance tax would be waived. So guess who bought the land? Very rich people bought lots of land, knowing that it was an investment, so the price of land went shooting up. And it produced something called a lifestyle farmer. So by 2007, the lifestyle farmers, the people who hire contractors to work the land, overtook those who were either born into the profession or possessed qualifications. That's one of the examples of the UK selling off its assets to make ends meet. So yes, the story of English farmland and what happened to it is particularly relevant now, because one of the first things that the Labour government did, elected last year, was to reinstate inheritance tax above a certain threshold. And this measure was seen as a direct attack on all farmers, who then were mobilized together as a group. As you can see, driving their tractors into the centre of London to protest on several occasions. I think this was in January. And this kind of mobilization of like these huge, enormous machines coming into the center of town where, they've been holding monthly demonstrations in support of Palestinians and against the war in Gaza. Huge sort of discussions about how they're policed. Very active environmental groups who are doing all forms of direct action. So the question of protest, which is increasingly policed, increasingly curtailed, increasingly criminalized, suddenly all that's sort of absent when these tractors come to town and blaring their horns and taking over the streets. And what's really interesting about it, what I find really interesting, is the way in which they're reported is entirely through a list of cliches of these country people coming to town. And there's always a thing about what they're wearing on their feet, their heads, their backs, and a sort of mocking sense that these people have come from outside to make their presence known. Mark, I thought you might like this slide. Someone who loves driving in the countryside. This is from Private Eye, the satirical magazine. So I draw attention to this partly because their case has been enthusiastically taken up by the far right. And in question of in alienating large sections of the rural vote by this kind of it's not exactly a sweeping measure to reinstate inheritance tax. It's an attempt to, as they tried to explain, complete cloth head, cloth ears, that it's all about numbers. The money would be then used for public services, which have been woefully cut back during periods of austerity. In alienating large sections of the rural vote, the government has completely underestimated the effective politics of connections to the land. So in fact, it becomes very significant politically if we just sort of allow the rural vote to be hoovered up by not just the Conservative Party, but the political party Reform, which is gathering more and more votes from the right. But anyway, this polarization goes back a long way. I didn't make a note of when I started, and as you just wave when you think I should stop, and I'll stop. Okay, somebody, Valashni. Wave. Yeah, okay. So in 1951, the Festival of Britain was held in central London to celebrate the country's recovery from the war years, to build its future. There was a section of the exhibition entitled The Country, where visitors were told that the gulf between the rural and urban Britain had to be addressed. And this is from the brochure of the Festival of Britain. Our theme is the land and the people, and such a theme is bound to bring to light some awkward facts. Here in this pavilion, we come across the first of these, the fact that in making what they have from the land, the people have become divided. By and large, they are now either countrymen or townsmen. The problem identified by a team of architects and conveners was how to prevent one section of our people from losing sight of the other. Farming is our heritage, no less than coal and steel. Farmers had come round to the value of science and were working with engineers to make the land the most highly mechanized and perhaps the most efficiently farmed country in the world. And so on. So we do know what happened next. They began to systematically poison the land with herbicides, pesticides, intensive farming, monocrops, and so on. We know exactly what happened next. So the book really, in making these kinds of discoveries, it attends to the history of agriculture, which shaped the area, but actually it's a wide-ranging inquiry that includes questions of class. How did these changes impact on the class composition of this particular rural community? And questions of labor, questions of gender and gendered labor and housing, and many other aspects, all considered from this one spot. The book actually covers roughly a year, which includes, in no particular order, a murder in the next village, the pandemic, a story about the history of chicken farming, the question of the concept of chickenization, the American summer of 2020, a fire in an automated distribution center in the local town, and the proposal to set up a holding center for 500 asylum seekers on the other side of town. But there's one particular thread I want to pull out today, just to give a sense of how quickly the world appears. If you just stand in one place and open your eyes and your ears and your senses, how quickly the world appears. So, this is a bit about local history. This building here, which as you can see has been renovated for apartments, it's got the date 1836 on it, was a workhouse. It was a workhouse, like in Oliver Twist, it was a workhouse. In the 1830s, there were reforms to the Poor Law, which had basically been the same since Elizabethan times. The country was divided into unions, which were a combination of several parishes, and the local landowners were appointed as guardians to build a workhouse, which was essentially a prison for those considered destitute and starving. The idea was that it made it so deeply unpleasant to end up in the workhouse, which some of you may be familiar from Dickens' stories, not Oliver Twist, some of the other stories, that actually to end up in a workhouse was to be worse than dead. It was kind of put people off, make them get a job, that kind of thing. But this practice in this particular workhouse for men and boys to be set to work in the boneyard to produce fertilizer, which was then sold on commercially. So this entailed pounding animal bones with a 28-pound pole, spiked at one end and collecting the resulting dust. Obviously very dangerous, unpleasant work. The bones, stripped of meat but still containing marrow and occasionally gristle, were supplied by a local butcher. On delivery, the men would fight over them, sometimes secreting them inside piles of ash and dirt to gnaw later. One inmate who was interviewed said, "We looked out for the fresh bones. We used to tell the fresh bones by the look of them, and then we used to be like a parcel of dogs after them. Some were not so particular about the bones being as fresh as others." There were rumors also that human bones were included in the consignments to be turned into fertilizer. There was actually a human skeleton suspended in the yard where the men worked. So this is a satirical drawing of the inmates of the workhouse fighting over old bones. It was published in the Penny Satire in September 1845. And alongside it, there was another cartoon of the Commission of Inquiry discussing the subject over a good dinner, which depicted 7 well-nourished gentlemen seated at the dining table talking amongst themselves, while filling their plates and glasses to the full. The images were jointly captioned "The Andover Bastille." So there was a national inquiry about this particular workhouse, and so these details came to light. And the details came to light for me because there was a social historian who'd written a book and gone through all the papers and everything in the 1960s, inspired by the movement to do history from the ground up. The intersection between this early form of coercing the poor and destitute and experimental innovations in agriculture was just the start. In the previous decade, there was an insurgency known as the Swing Riots, which was really the last rural uprising. It was kind of like a sort of Luddite rebellion for rural people, largely provoked by the introduction of mechanized farm implements, such as the threshing machine. And turned out that the riots were particularly active in this particular area. And as a result, it was obviously put down brutally, and several were executed and many were transported. But then it turned out that many of the landowners who'd been targeted by these rioters would have been the same as the guardians of the workhouse. So what seemed particularly interesting about this story was not just the local history, but it was the question of the bone meal itself. Why were they making bone meal, and what was the bone meal then used for? So John Bellamy Foster, from whom I've learned a lot about this particular political economy of bone meal, notes that in the 80s and 20s and 30s in Britain, and shortly after, in the developing capitalist economies of Europe and North America, pervasive concerns about soil exhaustion led to a virtual panic about the future of farming and a phenomenal increase in the demand for fertilizer. So this really is a point about fertilizer, what we can learn about the world from thinking about fertilizer. And this is a story that goes way beyond the things I found out in the book. Fertilizer is implicated in the war between Ukraine and Russia. This fertilizer is used as a weapon of war in countries such as, in places such as Gaza. The fertilizer is a commodity, a produce that we've allowed ourselves to become addicted to, which is seeps into all our lives, can I put it that way? So early soil science had established that plant roots needed calcium phosphate, which could be obtained from bones. These could be burnt or crushed, although the new breed of agricultural scientists who were really getting going in the sort of beginning of the 19th century were aware that even in this state, bone meal took a long time to disintegrate. I bet some of you use blood, fish and bone in your gardens. You have to be careful when you have foxes and coyotes around. But it is when we lived in the States, we bought I went to a garden centre, this was in 99, and I got a bag of fertilizer for the garden, for a nice green lawn, called For Your Piece of America. I can't find the photograph. I would have taken a photograph, but it wasn't digital. And it really struck me. You want your green lawn, then you have to use this stuff. It's your piece of America. So these experiments in fertilizers that were continuing, particularly phosphate in the 1830s, 1840s, one of the early scientists, John Bennett Laws, discovered that if bones were treated with sulfuric acid, they produced a more soluble phosphorus fertilizer, which increased the yield of his turnips. And he patented this invention, which became known as superphosphate, and established the world's first commercial fertilizer factory. And in 1843, he founded the Rothamsted Experimental Station with someone called Joseph Henry Gilbert, who had studied with Justus Freiherr von Liebig in Gießen in Germany. And of course, the question of where to find enough bones for the bone meal, and they wouldn't have been relying on the workhouses, but there had to be a source. And then, of course, it turns out that dead bodies, humans, horses, anything, are in fact a valuable source of bone meal. So this is the Battle of Waterloo, which apparently only took one day. It's the single most significant day's fight in European history. More than a million soldiers had perished during the Napoleonic Wars, and you can see in this picture, obviously many people died on the battlefields. Human remains could still be seen at Waterloo a year after the battle. In 1822, it was estimated that more than 1 million bushels of human and inhuman bones were imported last year from the continent of Europe into the port of Hull. And records from that year recorded that scarcely 5 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the battlefields of Leipzig, Austerlitz, Waterloo, and all the places where the principal battles were fought, quote, have been swept alike of the bones of the hero and the horse which he rode. After collection, the bones were shipped to the north of England, where they were sent on to Yorkshire bone grinders, who erected steam engines and powerful machinery for the purpose of reducing them to a granulary state. The bone meal was sent to agricultural markets in centres, other parts of northern England, and then sold on to farmers as fertiliser. Quote, the oily substance, gradually evolving as the bone calcines, makes a more substantial manure than almost any other substance, particularly human bones. This painting actually got from a report from a project of conflict archaeology carried out in conjunction with the British Army, called Operation Nightingale, which has been carried out since I forget when it started, something like 2010, of getting veterans, particularly veterans who'd been very badly wounded in Afghanistan, to learn the craft of archaeology, particularly conflict archaeology, whether it was Saxon warriors. Have I had enough?
No, not at all, but about 5.
About 5. Okay, fine. Okay, see, this just goes on and on. So that's interesting, and actually they do mention the bones and the fertilizer story in this report, but they call it a story. Obviously not convinced, even though what I read is a historical report from that particular year, 1822. Well, this brings us really on to other forms of fertilizer, guano. And I've just been reading a fantastic book by David Vine called Base Nation, which is about the history of US bases around the world. So he says, after the Civil War, US officials further increased the nation's Pacific presence and power by claiming and annexing Jarvis, Baker, Howlands, and Midway Island to mine guano deposits and serve as coaling stations. So it became a pretext for occupying these islands in the southern hemisphere for their guano products. And also Namibia, too, was first claimed by a German called Adolf Winter, who spotted a structure in the sea called Bird Island, which accreted a huge amount of guano at certain times, and then it could be harvested before the sea took it away. Anyway, these soil scientists were working on these questions, and Liebig, the most famous organic chemist of all, who'd also had his own factory actually for producing artificial fertilizers in Germany, had a complete change of heart. So he decided, and he was very influential for all kinds of reasons which are also relevant to now, the history of advertising, making food particularly for women, lots of innovative things based on his scientific approach to food and farming. He decided, looking at British farming, that the systematic extraction of minerals from the soil without replacing the nutrients absorbed by the body amounted to little more than robbery of the earth. More than that, it was an assault on the human's metabolic relationship with nature. What the soil holds in its womb, he wrote, is not the wealth of today's generation, because it belongs to future generations. And in a revised introduction to one of his most famous and influential works, he said, Great Britain robs all other countries of the conditions of their fertility. She's already ransacked the battlefields of Leipzig, Waterloo, and the Crimea for bones. She's ploughed up and used the skeletons of many generations accumulated in the catacombs of Sicily. We may say to the world that she hangs like a vampire on the throat of Europe and even the world, and sucks out its lifeblood without any real necessity or permanent gain to herself. And of course, Marx was an avid reader of Liebig, was very influenced by his work, and he was influenced by this change of direction. The revelation that soil was a fragile resource caused him to rethink his earlier optimism that scientific progress would eventually result in the overthrow of capitalism. So he adapted the concept of robbery to his own analysis, and in the first volume of Capital he states, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. So then, as I said, this is a story that unfolds. It unfolds through material that I came across when standing at this crossroads, one of which was an ongoing conversation with a farmer who was a bit younger than me. We weren't exactly friends, but we'd gone to the same primary school, junior school. I knew his family. And he was a businessman, but he was a conservationist, so we could just about manage a conversation. And I said, what do you use? What do you use on the farm? Knowing it would be, as little as possible. So he basically told me very matter-of-factly that he told this, that he did use this and that, a bit of nitrogen, a bit of this, a bit of chalk sometimes. And then he said, sewage cakes. So I was like, what do you mean sewage cakes? And basically, this is, what did he call it? Treated human sludge from Thames water. It has to be tested, and they limit the amount you can use to cover the ground. But it's been available to farmers as fertilizers for some time. It could be injected as well as just put on. I don't know how much you've heard of this, but it's been happening here for a very long time. So this is a kind of, boiled down, if I can use that word, boiled down sort of analysis of what happens. obviously there's 87% is recycled. Agriculture is in the UK, does biosolids. Has all kinds of uses. So in fact, it's a sort of circle of using what we should have been using all the time is actually human waste, animal manure, and sort of organic products. You can look all this up in the US. I say it's been going on since, forget how many years. Funnily enough, I have to stop. This is what I walked past on Bay Street just yesterday. And in fact, you can see it goes into the ocean. And that is exactly what was happening in the time that Liebig changed his mind, was the infrastructure of plumbing that was washing, because in other countries people used human waste and night soil for much longer than they did in Europe. It was Britain that was the outlier, and its sort of voracious desire to sort of expand and to extract. And so all the effluents and the water and the waste in London was being flushed into the sea. And Engels wrote a very interesting thing about that and how, how problematic that was for all kinds of other reasons, which I now can't find. So I should stop, I think. Well, that wasn't quite the end. I have to complete. Yeah, this is what Engels says. When one observes... What? Just finish what he said. He says, here in London, a great quantity of manure that is produced by the whole kingdom of... A greater quantity of manure that's produced by the whole kingdom of Saxony is poured away every day into the sea with an expenditure of enormous sums, and when one observes what colossal works are necessary in order to prevent this manure from poisoning the whole of London, then the utopian proposal to abolish the antithesis between town and country is given a particularly practical basis. Okay.
I assume it's the same structure exactly, so 15 minutes for questions. So I invite anyone who has a question to start discussion. Any questions or comments? Chris? Oh, and Dimitris?
I was thinking of a guy named Robert Powerzik, who died last week. He lived on the hill up here in Bonnie Doon, and he wrote about 6 books on the lime kilns of this county, which you may have come across on hikes. And there's a really huge kind of local history scene, and has been for some time, in Santa Cruz County and everywhere else that I know of in the United States. And it's a group of people who kind of, as far as I know in the US, almost never intersect with academia and never intersect with a kind of theorization and thinking project. And I wondered if, and I'm assuming that these people existed and wrote and worked in your area where you did your work. And I wonder if, if you had any interaction with that kind of really local, and very prolific kind of non-professional, non-academic history making.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, I'm not an ethnographer in any sense of sort of looking for people to talk to. What helped me was doing some interviews, getting an academic grant in 1998, which I said I would do interviews, so I had to do interviews. And I didn't really want to speak to anyone, but I did manage to get a few interviews done at that time from people who I had known or who recommended, who were a certain age and generation that they had remembered what it was to work on the land when everybody worked on the land. So the women, for example, could remember through what happened through the 1939 to 1945, when everyone grew their own food. So there was a sense of that memory that I could trace back in terms of what happened when there was no longer any work through the 1950s and 60s as everything became mechanized, which was incredibly valuable. And it was a way of learning to make shape of the place and to understand the sort of the class formations that had been shifted to education and other forms of work, including working in new industries in the local town, for example. So to that extent, I had access to those kind of conversations that were very memorable. And they weren't necessarily nostalgic, although when I interviewed somebody who was sort of 88 in 1998, he could comment on the fact that his grandparents, who'd come in the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century, were always going on about how much things had changed. And of course, this is the beginning of Country in the City. Everybody's always looking back and thinking how much things have changed so rapidly. And everybody always thinks that. When in fact, they're changing everywhere. It's not just in those kinds of places. But there's a particular way of thinking about change and the relation and nostalgia in the rural areas. So in terms of having those conversations, yeah, I didn't really do that kind of research. But I did pay a lot of attention to local media. What's left of it.
I didn't see you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You describe the land and the larger factors and forces that form the land, both humans and globalization and chemicals and so on. I wonder if you can say more for the perhaps small-scale forces, all of these alternative projects that make the land, all these different movements, people, social movements, but also communities and other projects that make the British land. I spent quite a lot of time in Spalding, and probably you know that Spalding is in the Fens, is the most conservative or one of the most conservative places in Britain. And I didn't go there initially because of the land. I went there because I wanted to find out where alternative feedstocks to oil can come to create alternative chemicals. And there is a lot of agricultural production. So I tried to think how this happens, and I started talking to people, and I started talking to farmers, and I started to appreciate the land. Of course, my voice box and my pronunciation didn't help to go very far with these farmers. But I kept going, and I started photographing the place. And I started finding all these other stories of reclaiming the land and remaking the land through many projects of alternative agricultural practices, histories, remaking histories, unearthing histories of exploitation or of oppression. And the Fens is, of course, a space of colonial appropriation of land. Then I started thinking about the black photographer Ingrid Pollard walking the paths of the Lake District and photographing herself in these paths and thinking about the meaning of reclaiming this land through walking in this land as a black person in Britain in the 60s and 70s. And then I found a ballad. It was close to John Clare's land near Peterborough. I found a ballad, and I was trying to think of the histories of this ballad. And as I was looking for there, I found the book of E.P. Thompson, who was mentioning this ballad and the local communities there and the local struggles. And E.P. Thompson was writing something that stayed with me for this project, that there is not a single piece of English land and landscape that hasn't been the outcome of a struggle. There is always a struggle for reclaiming this land in both ways. And of course, he was referring to the enclosures of the 1830s and the enclosures of the commons and all this process. But this continues. So I wanted to ask you if we can see the perspective from the other side. And I want to close with this idea that came to me when we were doing a project with Maria, which is called Ecological Reparation. And we were interviewing different people for a YouTube channel that we have. And we interviewed a collective of a black agricultural alternative land collective. It's called Lion, Land in Our Names.
Get their emails, yeah.
Okay. And it came to me through this discussion that this is truly a practical, everyday, ongoing struggle to come close to the land and to rethink the land and to appropriate the land and to feel it and to work it and to be there and to bring also joy in being in the land. So I just wanted to ask for the other side of this project.
Yes, in fact, those are conversations and threads that I've picked up, I've gone on working with afterwards. Did you read that Imperial Mud book about the Fens? It's fantastic, isn't it? When you delve into these local histories and you read about the sort of brutality, the forcing off, the holding on, remaking and so on, it's incredible. I've always been interested in finding the way out, the door, growing up in this village, wanting to find the world. And that's one of the things I was interested in, that actually standing in this godforsaken place, wasn't really anywhere. You could see, for example, the Chinook helicopters going to the military base, which was just 10 miles to the west on Salisbury Plain. We grew up with the sound of guns at night. So the world, it was all around. One of the interlocutors, I won't say I interviewed them, but interlocutors, the man who told me about this downland that was ploughed and then not given back, had come from an estate over the hill, and he talked about, very movingly, about when he was a child and how the evacuated kids suddenly appeared, and refugees appeared, soldiers appeared. The American army was based all along the southern part all along through the southern part of England in preparation for D-Day. So the world is there all the time, the making of the world. In terms of the alternative, I mentioned the American summer of 2020 happened. So I'm looking to see where is this registered in this small place, and I'm looking in the local newspaper. There was a demonstration in support of Black Lives Matter, 75 people in the local town, for example. You can find these things. Ingrid Pollard is an old friend, so she's been part of those discussions for a long time. Yes, there is a big movement around black people in the countryside in terms of birding, cycling, walking, and a kind of reclaiming of a space where people have felt excluded. But I think one of the reasons people feel excluded is not because necessarily of the hostility they feel when they're in those places. It's a kind of internalized, I shouldn't be here, there's no one who looks like me, who are these people who live here? It's a very ingrained sense that these places are not comfortable and inclusive spaces to be in compared to the metropolitan centres and the larger cities. And some of that is to do with this polarity, this dichotomy. But, things are changing. But on the scale of this particular project, I can't say that there was anything that interesting happening nearby. But I don't know. There's a really thriving folk club, which is very well known, just a few miles away. Jennifer.
Oh, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you for mentioning feminist curiosity and invoking Adrienne Rich. And I wanted to ask you a question about feminism in this project. It's a very simple question, which is, you started with this, this 19th century, 18th century portrait of a man and a woman sitting overlooking the land. And I just wondered how gender as well as feminism factored in the research questions that you asked for this project, how you started thinking about it in certain moments, how feminism came up for you, and just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think how feminism came in was when women went to work in the factories. That's what I was told. So it changed the whole pattern of life. People were not at home all day. So there's a chapter called Women's Business, which explores these partly through a sort of memory of growing up there and having, various people who came into our house and people's houses I went to, and the way that the class structure of the community was entirely different. So it was the class transformation was very profound and increased separation between people rather than an interreliance. And the question of feminism, I would say it never really came up, but it was something other from the cities, but it was manifest in terms of what sort of changes in education, changes in work, and a sense of sort of general modernization, really.
Anna?
Thanks very much. I wanted to go back for a minute to that 1951 festival where they marked the distinction between the countryside and the city, and they said the way to break that, to bring back the unity of rural and urban, was technological fixes. And it seems to me, how do I put it, those 19th century soil scientists like Liebig were part of the problem in their conception of the soil as a bag of nutrients. And so, of course, it actually does work if you throw some phosphates or nitrogen, including human waste, on top of them. It does work. But my understanding is we've had a complete revolution in how we see soils that makes that seem like a sort of idiotic way to address the problem of the soil, that now that we think of the soil as a living set of organisms that ends up working together to make it possible for plants to, on their own, without adding a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, to be able to get at all the kinds of sources of nutrients and water that are around. And that, in a way, John Bellamy Foster has been part of the problem in bringing us back to that Marx robbing the soil stuff, because it keeps us thinking that we have this bag of nutrients and then we run out, instead of thinking about enlivening soils and, living with all these multiple kinds of organisms that we're so busy killing all the time. I'm not sure that even these folks who are trying to use alternative fertilizers, I know you didn't get to the present and that there was a lot that you didn't tell us, but I just wanted to kind of register that some of these folks that we're still looking back to as saviors are really part of the problem, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much for that. In fact, just last week I read something about that new experiments had discovered that the soil could, that actual varieties of wheat could fertilize themselves through their roots. Some extraordinary new, I don't know what you would call it.
This is this, what do they call it? It's a permanent instead of a seasonal wheat that they're growing now.
Yes.
So that you don't, instead of digging it up all the time and disturbing the soil over and over again, you can keep it growing there.
So there are other routes that could have been followed. Yes, I think, Liebig's an interesting, phenomenal character, isn't he, for all his innovations, but absolutely, but they set the country on the path. And the way that the Festival of Britain pamphlet talks about those discoveries, which again puts Britain in the fore, the best, the fastest, etc., is also part of the problem. It's wanting to just extract, to find, to produce more and more and more. It's the thing about growth. And I had a quote from Murray Bookchin, which really encapsulated all these issues together, but I didn't want it to cut down. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I think I find this particular part of your book very interesting, and I was really happy that was the example you brought up, because I think the whole question of the industrialization and the creation of I don't know. Yeah, is this working? Yeah, it is. Oh, okay. I just wanted to say I was really happy that you focused on that particular chapter of the book, because I've been really interested in the origins of industrialized fertilizer in Britain and the experiments at Rothamsted. And
Can't believe it. I can't believe
Yeah,
it. We
it's-
didn't know that before.
It was really-
Somebody else who.
Yeah, and I hope on Thursday,
Yeah.
we have more time to talk about it. But one of the questions that is brought also by, I was hoping, Anna, you came back and talked about this issue, but you didn't mention, I was discussing this with Anna the other day about the emergence of the idea that soil needs to be fertilized. And how the soil exhaustion was both created by the same people or the same ideas that we're trying, and how you formulate it now, it's even further than you had said before, the idea of soil fertility, and that we are still thinking today through those frameworks, even in thinking alternative ways of fertilizing the soil. And suddenly when I was listening to you and reading a little bit of your earlier work about women, and I was thinking, maybe there is something to think about this whole, how the idea of fertility became something that was so embedded in how do we extract value from people and the soil, and women in particular, and thinking of ecofeminist questions as, like going back to even Carolyn Merchant, of how the idea of, or how Anna puts it, man stalking earth. And so I thought these questions right now, given the whole taboo, difficult question about how many people we are, how much do we grow, how much do we do of everything. And the fact that, because you mentioned now, wheat that self creates fertilizer, so the process by which some legumes can create the fixation of nitrogen in order to be able to access it and become something that the plants can process, and then we can eat the plants that process that fertilization. That process is very rare in nature. It's extremely rare. It's called nitrogen fixation, and it's created by some kind of symbiosis, but also by lightning. And what the creation of nitrogen fertilizers did was create a massive industry that was able to nourish and to create more people. Without that, we probably, only 25% of us would be here. So I was just trying to think of this notion of fertility that I hadn't thought before today, basically, connecting these questions might be some interesting critical,
Absolutely.
connecting the critical imagination around how do we exploit the soil and people. So, yeah. Sorry. You have a question? The last, because we have only 2 minutes.
It was more of an observation, because I'm a old style kind of form versus content person, I think. I'm an old style form versus content person in a way, and what I found most fascinating, of course I found this discussion very fascinating in Vron's book, and really important in many ways, but I just wanted to remind people that it has a very innovative formal quality, which is inserting Vron's voice as an author, as it's sort of kind of autobiographical, but actually the Vron's creation of a subject disappears in the process of exploring these different historical events, and it could be an endless project in a way. It could be like, the Saragossa manuscript or something like that. It has, that particular form. And I was also thinking about ways of writing about nature, whether it's Thoreau or Gilbert White, because in a way how we talk about different aspects of the country, for example, bird watching or, plant hunting or whatever, often gets quite separated out from these other kinds of questions. So I thought, it's quite a potential, it's quite an interesting project it's like auto-theoretical. As it happened, we discovered about auto-theory just around now when we were meeting with Ron and Paul, and Velashny's conference was going on. So in a way, it's just recommending the book for its structure as well as for the particular observations, if you can separate the two.
I think that's a great way to invite everyone to read this book, and also to invite anybody who is interested, especially among graduate researchers and students here. We are doing a small discussion around some chapters of the book with Vron on Thursday at 11:30. And if you are interested, just contact me and I can send you the texts. We can have a discussion. Thank you so much, Vron.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you.